It's Allison and Lee from the Bar Exam Toolbox. Today we're talking about common struggles with the bar exam performance test. Well, Lee, for anyone who might be unfamiliar, what is the performance test? I mean, is this like a talent show or something that you do on the bar exam?
Oh, totally. There's tap dancing. It's amazing. The performance test is designed to be like a work project that you would get, an assignment at a job where you are either writing a letter or often a memo or a brief to the court. I've even seen ones that have you do a closing argument. But it's an assignment and it's closed universe, which means that you don't need to know any law for it. And that makes it the best.
Definitely. I'm pretty sure I only passed the bar exam because of the performance test in California, which we had two at that point, thank goodness. And one of them happened to be on my moot court topic. I was like, wow, that was a gift from the bar exam gods.
You didn't need to know that because all the law was in the packet, because the packet has both facts and then it also has a library that has cases or statutes. And everything you need to know is in the packet.
It is, although I will say it was pretty reassuring that I was like, oh, I definitely know this law. I'm just going to go quickly through and double check those things that I already know. But yeah, that's not normal. Usually it's something you've never seen before. And it can be like a memo, a brief, it can be persuasive, it can be objective. You get weird things, closing arguments, like you said, articles of incorporation. We call those the wild card options. And, you know, that is actually one of the ways that people really struggle, I think, on the PT. Is some people really freak out about the style of the question. So if they get something they're not expecting, they just lose it. And like you said, everything is there. So I think one of the ways that people can actually get more comfortable with this is by looking at more PTs and kind of seeing like, oh, some weird stuff comes up. But they almost always give you a sample in that case. And that's one of the things that you can just follow very like religiously. You know, this is the sample. This is what they gave me. This is what I'm going to do. But people do really freak out sometimes about those wild cards. What else do people really struggle with?
I think time management is a big one because it is 90 minutes, which sounds like a long time, but is really not a long time when you consider that you have to read this huge packet of information and organize an answer and then execute it. So time management is huge. I think this is especially difficult for anyone for whom English is their second language, foreign trained attorneys especially, to write under that amount of time pressure in English that's just really hard. I could not do it in the foreign languages I have studied. So I have so much respect for foreign trained attorneys that are coming to do the bar exam in English, but that makes it really challenging as well. So it's challenging for everyone, but I think that class of bar takers has a specific challenge around time management and the performance test.
Yeah, and so we will talk later in this podcast a little about time management. And I think we're also going to release a quick tips episode only on time management for the PT. So if that is something you're struggling with, we definitely have some options and tips for you, but we're not going to go into all of them today. I think another thing people really fall down on here is the planning process. So failing to plan the answer so that it is disorganized and is really hard to grade. And I think a lot of this does go back to the time pressure. People think, well, you know, as soon as I finish reading it, I just have to start writing. And I think that is a really, really big mistake. And also one of the things that can make you just miss the point of the question, whether it's lack of attention to detail or you're trying to read too fast. Maybe you just got unlucky, you overlooked something. But if you miss the entire point of the question, it doesn't really matter what you write down. It is not going to go well.
We read a lot of questions, passing and failing ones, because we even read passing ones in packets of information from a student who has failed. And I'm always shocked at how often the highest scoring answers are not the longest. And so I think that that is really something that you have to sit with and become okay with, is realizing that hearing the frantic typing around you does not mean that they have their act together and they're going to necessarily score better than you are. Because if you write about the correct things, you can collect a lot of points without having to write as much. You just don't have to write that much if it's all on point.
No, I don't think sometimes people overcomplicate this. They think that there must be something they're missing. But sometimes, I mean, a lot of these are designed to be answered in 90 minutes. They can't be that complicated. You know, they have to have fairly clear law that they're giving you somewhere in the packet. You have to have the elements of the rules. They must be there, or otherwise there's no way anyone can write an answer. So this is another 80-20 thing of if you're getting the main points of the question and you have a structured answer that addresses them one by one in a systematic way and uses the majority of the facts that you've been given, that's probably going to be a passing answer.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that, having a solid plan and approach for how you're going to take on this assignment is really important. We've talked about almost this idea that it's like you have like a failure to launch if you don't have a have a plan. You get this packet, you look down, you're like, oh my goodness, it's so big. There's so much. There are all these words. I'm supposed to read them. I'm supposed to synthesize them. But if you have a plan about how you're going to approach the packet, how you're going to outline your answer, how you're going to take notes, whatever it might be, that is going to really help you. So there are lots of general recommendations about what those plans are. I think the key is that through practice, which we're going to talk about in a second, you tweak your plan to work for you because you are your own unique test taker and you have to make sure that this is going to get you where you need to be.
Definitely. And it's actually shocking to me sometimes how little people practice the PT. As you said earlier, it can be your favorite part of the test because you don't have to memorize anything. But that doesn't mean you don't need to do at least some of them. And even people who are really strong writers need to do at least a few of these. I'm not going to tell you need to do 10 of them if you're a really strong writer and you do a few and they come out pretty well. And you're like, yeah, that's probably passing. But, this is an artificial exercise. And even a strong writer can get really hung up with the timing and just not having a plan for tracking things and end up in a situation where they're over time. They're just not finishing something. And the other thing, sometimes we talk with attorneys who are not passing the bar and they think, oh, the PT, I should be able to do this. I'm a practicing lawyer. This is crazy that I'm getting these terrible scores. But this is an artificial exercise and really everybody is going to need to practice it, I think.
I think that's true. When we work with attorney applicants, often they'll write it like they would to a client. And this is not necessarily client work. This is bar exam work. And with small tweaks, writing in strict IRAC, using correct headers, all of that kind of stuff, they can collect more of those points. But just with a little feedback, this is a very accessible part of the test for almost anyone, but especially attorney applicants.
Right. I think it's just you have to get used to writing in this format. You have to get used to the time constraints. You have to understand what it even is. What are they presenting you? Well, they're giving you a file and they're giving you a library. Okay, well, what does that mean? Which one should I read first? These are all the type of things that you want to have thought about beforehand, not when you first land that packet of stuff on your desk and you're like, oh gosh, what am I even looking at right now? And some people honestly just freak out, whether it's test anxiety or something else going on. People just sometimes really lose it. And then they're spinning and they can't get anything done. And, the time is passing and they're getting more and more frantic. I think that's often something that needs to be addressed outside of your bar prep, whether it's with a therapist or something. But if that's something that happens a lot to you on the PT, I think it's sort of a bigger problem because until you address that, you're not going to be able to focus and kind of get this done.
I will say one trick I've used with students who really struggle with the PT is I'll ask them to keep a notepad next to their workstation and, write down what time they started and then write down the points in the performance test process where it seems to fall apart. Because I think that sometimes we have a hard time deciding when it falls apart. So especially someone with, let's say, ADHD, it could be that at 30 minutes, their mind is just off to something else. It is feeling jumbled. And then it can be like, cool. So at 25 minutes, if that happens a few times, what are we going to do to right the ship? Because we know 30 minutes is coming. We don't want to feel lost. Is there an activity we can do at 25 minutes? Could it be a breathing exercise? Could we stand up and stretch? Whatever it might be. Is there something we can do to interrupt the pattern? Or it could be, as you're writing, everybody can have these different pain points where focus can be difficult or you get distracted. And you can build in these coping mechanisms into your PT process. Nobody cares if you do 5 deep breaths at 25 minutes. No one will ever know, but that might right the ship. And so being really thoughtful about, where these struggles are happening, allow you to get creative and and come up with solutions that even you could use in the exam room.
I think that's a great idea because I think everybody does have kind of their own struggles here and their own ways of approaching this. And you can't just kind of open a book or a website or whatever and get like the perfect advice for the PT. You have to figure out what's actually going to work for you. And your struggles may be different than the struggles of the person sitting right beside of you. Well, on that note, let's talk a little bit more about why do you think people are running out of time? So, we mentioned kind of uncontrollable things that make you maybe slower at reading, such as, English not being your first language. I think for some people, ADHD may be an issue, just staying focused for this whole package. And like you said, 30 minutes in, you're most of the way through the material and your mind's kind of off in 4 different directions and you're having to reread things. I think people don't necessarily know how to skim. I was talking to a friend of mine recently who's an English professor about this, and she's like, no, skimming is actually really a skill. It's something we might not need to do in real life soon because we can just have the AIs do it for us. But on the bar exam, you are going to need to be able to skim through these materials. So if you're not comfortable skimming, I think even something like reading a newspaper, maybe even in paper format, could be really great. Just so you're not trying to absorb every single word. So I think sometimes people can get really bogged down and like everything could be really important and they're just not sure what's important. And that's going to slow you down a lot.
I think that's true. And with the cases in the library part of the PT, the cases or the statutes, they are not hiding the ball. I mean, they are basically going to have a factor test with numbered factors. Or it's going to say something like, in this jurisdiction, the settled law on this issue. I mean, they are going to use signposts for you to help with the skimming. And so as you practice being very aware of that to try and speed up your reading is very important. I mean, fortunately, you can often skip the facts section of almost every case if you need to find some more time, because any legally significant facts will be discussed in the analysis portion. So, you just really are looking for that paragraph with the numbered factors, which typically exist, that you need to put into your outline.
Right. I mean, they have to tell you what the law is. This is not like a huge
and they're not hiding
problem,
the ball.
Typically. No, it's typically like, here's some very clear law. Maybe there's a little bit of other law that comes from a different case or statute or something. But, 90 minutes is not much time. This cannot be super complicated. You got to basically pull out the main points, find any other little details you might need to talk about, link the facts up, and get to work.
Also, I think it's important to remember that there's a right answer because it is a constructed reality. And so they have given you the puzzle pieces. So, it's not the real world where there's a ton of ambiguity. They are comparing your answer to a right answer. And I think that's important to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, definitely. And again, it may tell you to be, writing an objective memo or a persuasive memo. So there may be a few things you need to be like, well, they could argue this or they could argue that, or our best position might be X, Y, or Z. But generally speaking, this stuff is going to be fairly clear cut. Part of what you've got to do as you're working on this is keeping track of this law and these basic facts in some sort of structured way that's easy to reference later as you're writing. So, you're not going to get any points for talking about things that are irrelevant, but there are definitely things that you need to talk about. So however you do this, there needs to be some process by which you're documenting something before you start writing, or otherwise, you're probably going to run out of time because you're just going to be rambling on, and you're also not going to be getting points because it's going to be super hard to follow.
And this doesn't have to be super complicated. My own personal technique is a big star next to the law in the case that I've read. And then at the end of reading that case, I write at the top of the page why I think that case is in the packet or why that statute's in the packet. And then after I read them all, I sit down with my scratch paper and I put the puzzle pieces together because they all have to basically fit together some way. I think it's so important to remember that this is not like legal research where you get things that are totally off topic. Everything's on topic. So figure out why it was included in the packet and then put it in your outline. If it doesn't make sense, then you've missed something.
Yeah. And I think keeping track, for me, I agree. I would always make a note of why is this in here? Some people prefer just to read through and then you make your outline. But for me, I always like to have like, this seems important. And I would even have a running list of things that like seemed important, but I wasn't really quite sure how they fit in. And, page 3, this tiny little thing, like, how does that fit in here? So that then when I'm going back, I'm not like, oh my gosh, like, where is this stuff? I mean, if you are running out of time, I think you also have to try to write really concisely and really directly. Trying to sound smart here is not the goal. These should be short sentences to the point, like, these are the elements. Element 1 is met or is not met because of give the fact. That sort of style of writing, not going on about things like in detail or any of that. Like, you just need to be crisp and to the point, and that is probably going to get you the most points.
And don't not follow directions. I mean, I have seen failing performance tests that the directions say, do not include a statement of facts. And then the student included the statement of facts, and then they failed. And they were like, well, why did they ding me? I was like, well, 1, you didn't follow directions, which is a huge part of being a lawyer, is just following directions. And 2, you wasted a whole bunch of time. Like, you got no points for those paragraphs of the statement of facts that you wrote. Like, not a great choice. And so make sure that you are only talking about what is part of the question, what is relevant, and that you're following directions and not wasting time. It's just such a silly way to lose points.
It really is. And it's like, you don't even know why people do this. I mean, do they just kind of jump into it? They haven't really read carefully they will always tell you exactly what to do. And like I said, if it's anything remotely weird, they will give you a sample to follow. Mm-hmm. So if they ask you to draft articles of incorporation, most likely they're going to show you what that looks like, because they don't expect that you're a corporate attorney. They don't expect that you know what that looks like. You're going to have something to base this off of. But yeah, failing to follow instructions because you just didn't read the question carefully enough, you didn't really get clear on what you're being asked to do, is such a killer here.
Such a killer. Yeah. You really also just need to, refine that plan and then stick to it in the exam room. Because I have also had students who have a really great plan in practice and they follow it and they're getting passing answers. And then I get their scores and it's not passing answers. And I'm like, what happened in the room? I heard everybody typing, or I was starting to plan, but I got distracted, or I was too stressed, or. And the reality is, you've got to do what you've proven works for yourself and stick to those rules. So as you practice and develop you can call it a pre-writing approach, whatever it might be, figure it out, test it, and then stick to it. Don't reinvent the wheel in the exam room specifically.
No, I hear that a lot. People are like, well, yeah, I did practice like doing these things, but then they gave me like a really weird question and I just kind of freaked out and started writing. And like, it's hard, it's the old boxing saying, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. But I do think ideally that you've done enough of these that this really should be a habit. So, and it could be as simple as something as, which section are you going to consistently read first? Do you read the file or do you read the library? People have different preferences. Which parts of the packet are you going to pay the closest attention to? So generally, if you have a case or a statute, that's probably going to be more fundamental or important than some other type of material. So you might want to focus on that first. Then skim the other stuff quickly. You're looking for nuances you can add, but you've got to be skimming for those, factor tests and elements and like the settled law in this jurisdiction is, those kind of things. Mm-hmm. You can even do on a really quick skim through the packet, just underlining or highlighting them to make sure that you don't leave that out later.
And like you said, if it is a wild card and you may want to take a few minutes and see what the assignment actually looks like, that may be the place to start before you do anything else, to say, okay, it looks like, it's a closing argument. I'm not really sure what that is, but it just kind of looks like a persuasive brief. So maybe I'll, okay, now I've got that in my head and now I'm going to go into the library. I don't think there's a right answer about what you read first. You just need to be thoughtful about it and figure out how you're going to, track things. And again, test and refine and commit to a way that you're going to do it in the exam room. And when you get to the packet, that's the file, which has all of the facts in it, and it could be depositions, it could be, letters, it could come in lots of different forms. You have to think about how you're going to track those details. So are you going to, like you said, read it quickly over, kind of tracking major details, and then go back, and go line by line looking for the things that you need that will fit into the law that you found? Are you going to mark up that packet so you can kind of do your first read kind of carefully and then go back and look for the parts you've mocked up? Again, you've got to explore, see what works for you, but you've got to test it and see what works best. You could index by page number, you could have different highlighters. There are lots of different options, but you have to practice the different options. And depending on where your own skill sets plus pain points are, you may want to adjust. Maybe you are really good at keeping facts in your head and you don't need to take copious notes, but keeping the law in a structured way requires a lot more work for you. So you want to spend more time creating that outline and that structure. I mean, it's really up to you, but you want to evaluate what's working and then change what you're doing if you're struggling with certain parts of this assignment.
I agree. And a lot of this comes back to what has worked for you in the past. Are you like a big picture thinker? So for me, I need like the big picture of the law, and then I'm pretty good at remembering factual details. So I might be able to, get the law down, understand what I'm looking for, then rapidly skim through all the factual stuff and just pull out some stuff, into my mind map outline that I do, and not necessarily be doing a ton of, really detailed note taking, because I'm going to remember like, oh yeah, like that thing. But other people are not great at that. So I think it is really a question of what's going to work for you. I've even heard of people just kind of reading everything, letting it wash over them for 20 or so minutes, and then doing like 10 or 15 minutes of outlining. Maybe that works for you. That sounds a little wild to me, but it definitely works for certain people. So yep. Exactly. And I think as you're making your plan, you want to be thinking about these timings. So when are you going to start writing? What are you going to commit to? Because the timing is so critical. I always like to build in like a little bit of a buffer. So if I had 90 minutes, instead of giving myself 45 minutes to read and plan, maybe I give myself 40 minutes. So I have that 5-minute buffer of like, oh gosh, I really need another couple minutes to do this. But maybe that would stress you out. I don't know. But I always like to have a little bit less time than I had available. And then that gave me like just that tiny little bit of extra to finish stuff up. But again, like you want to practice your timing. You're going to spend 30 minutes reading and then 15 minutes outlining and then 45 minutes writing. That seems totally reasonable. But maybe 30 minutes doesn't work. Maybe it's 35 and you take 10 to do your outlining, whatever. Whatever works for you, I think, is the key, but you need to have an actual plan, like literally written out with timings of when to move on, because I think that just kills so many people.
Another thing that folks don't often consider doing is, let's say the part of the performance test that's the hardest for you is the reading, organizing, putting together the outline. It's not the written execution. Sometimes when people tell me that they don't have time to study for the PT, I'm like, cool, then just do the first 45 minutes. I want you to do full ones too. Don't like no soundbite on that one. You don't have to do a full performance test. But let's say that that's the most challenging piece. Well, you could do some where you just say, okay, this is 45 minutes and I'm going to sit down and I'm just going to do this beginning part and get really used to what that 45 minutes or 40 minutes or whatever you want to give it feels like, because repetition is going to make you feel more and more comfortable. So there are things that you can do to make the practice around this a bit more accessible, even if you feel like you don't always have 90 minutes to sit down and do the whole entire thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's good advice. And the more of these you see, the less freaked out you're going to be when you get one that doesn't feel like a memo or a brief. And if you are consistently really, really struggling with that timing of the first part, I would say, again, just practice giving yourself even less time. What can you do in 35 minutes? What can you do in 40 minutes? I think people often go the other direction and they're like, oh, well, if I had 75 minutes to outline, I could do a really great job. It's like, well, sorry, you don't. So,
right. Nobody's going to read it after that amount of time. So, yeah.
Like, great. Congratulations. You have 20 minutes to write. That's not going to go well. So I think people tend to be a little more indulgent, where I actually think they should go the other way and like make it really forced to be fast and see what you can do, because that's what's going to force you to speed up.
And I think even really breaking it down into those chunks and saying, okay, you have 30 minutes to read the packet. You have 15 minutes to plan. Set the stopwatch on your phone and make sure that realize what that feels like. I think that's also a really great way to practice kind of this accountability. I have sometimes told students who really want to take like too many notes that they have to sit on their hands while they do their first read and just read it with their eyes.
Right.
They are too distracted by note taking, and then they're not really focused on the information kind of washing over them. I mean, it might sound silly, but again, the deep breaths, sitting on your hands, nobody really knows what you did to pass. So you've got to try these different tricks to keep yourself focused.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the key thing is you want to make sure you get something down for all of the parts of the question, even if it is not a perfect answer. So if you have gotten most of what you have to say on a topic down, you have to move on to the next part. And, say that in some cases, they might ask you to address multiple parts of a question. Again, I would map out that time for my writing in advance. So if it's a 3-part question, I have 45 minutes. That means I'm going to give myself 12 to 15 minutes per topic. And then I'm going to force myself to move on. Because if you're not tracking that, you're not thinking about it, you're going to spend too much time on the first point. And you're not going to have time for the end. And again, this is just, you've got to get the basic stuff so that you can get as many points across the board. Even if you have to bullet point things, I mean, that's better than nothing. But it's definitely the worst thing you can do is do a really complete answer to the first half of the question and then write nothing at the end.
You also have to remember how fast they're reading these questions. They are going through them incredibly fast. And so if it looks good and complete, it might be.
Might be good enough.
Might be good enough and complete enough. So I do also kind of the balance of bullet pointing versus not. I also encourage you to make it look complete, because then you're going to not wave a flag in front of them and say, well, I ran out of time. I was just dropping whatever I could at the end. You want to try and make it so they have to hunt to figure out that you kind of don't have your act together and didn't get it done.
Right. And this is where the samples, if they have any, really come in. Making it look right is going to go a long way, because if somebody, reads your answer and they're like, oh, they clearly didn't finish a third of it and they bullet pointed half of the rest of it, that's not a passing answer. Give them a 1, move on to something else,
like 100%.
Oh, that was great. Like, I don't have to spend 5 minutes on this question. I can spend 1 minute on this question and give them a failing grade. So you don't want to be that person. You want to be the person that they have to really hunt for reasons not to give you a passing score.
And we have to raise it again because it's so important. One of the easiest ways to show that they should fail you is to not follow the directions. Just please follow the directions. They're so direct. They're really direct. They're not ambiguous. Just follow them.
Right. And, you should know what something like a memo to a law firm partner looks like. It should have a to, it should have a from, it should have a date, it should have a subject. These are things that if you're unfamiliar with the basic structure, again, you need to look at some answers, because nobody's trying to make this that hard here. It's just you need to do these things. The other thing that I think is really critical that I've talked to some people recently who did not do and found it did not help their score is just doing individual PTs is not actually sufficient. So it's great that you sat down and you did one of these in 90 minutes, but unfortunately the test is not structured that way. So if you're taking the UBE, you get 2 PTs for 3 hours. If you're taking California, you get multiple essays plus a PT. So there's a difference in doing the timing and the stamina for that versus just doing 1 PT. So while we definitely encourage you to do lots of timed practice, you also have to do these full sets of timed practice, because we'll often see scores where it's a 1 and a 4 or a 1 and a 5. And I'm like, oh, what happened? Did you run out of time? Oh, yeah, I gave, 2 hours to the first question and 1 hour to the second. Yeah,
it's such a bad
not going to go well. Yeah,
no.
It's just not going to go well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You do have to be very disciplined to stop working on one and move to the other. And that is hard to do in the testing environment.
It's hard. But if you don't do it, you're going to be out of time on something else. And overall, you're looking for the best overall score. You're not looking for the best PT score on one of these essays.
Yep, exactly. Well, as we wrap up, any final thoughts about the performance test?
I would just say keep the big picture in mind. Take the 80-20 approach. You can get a very good score not having every single detail if you just have a clean, structured answer that looks good. It sounds like you're a professional. It sounds like you're a lawyer. It doesn't have a ton of typos. As you said, now say your answer is wearing a suit, not a sweatpants. But you want to take that second of time and energy to say, okay, like, is this really presenting me as a lawyer? Remember, you are applying to be a lawyer. This is what this part of the test is about. You need to be convincing on that point.
Yeah. And I would just come to this part of the test with some optimism because you do not need to know any law. It is the best part of the test. So you have the skills to pass it. It can be intimidating, but take the win that if you work on it and come up with your plan and your approach and practice, this is a completely attainable part of the test. And I think oftentimes folks just assume they're not going to be able to conquer it. And I think it is really something that is attainable.
I think anyone who passes the bar is very capable of passing the performance test.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us. You can check out barexamtoolbox.com for more helpful tips and to learn about our tutoring and course options for California and the UBE. Please subscribe and we'll talk soon.